the atomic turtle that's as strong as he can be. Gamera.
This time we watched KTMA Episode 5, Gamera.
Based on the classic Bible tale of Sodom and Gamera.
Yeah. But first, some follow-up.
Yes, over on our YouTube channel, which, by the way, people apparently use YouTube for podcasts. Who knew? Our listener, Amy, comments about our last episode on Mac and Me. She says, I get the feeling our riffers mostly avoid the subject of the aliens' faces because to do so is to venture into some uncomfortable metaphoric territory involving dark-skinned foreigners. See also Binks, Jar Jar, which is an interesting take. But more, I guess, that we can comment on, because that is some food for thought, but an immediate comment can be made, is that there is a correction. So this is also, in addition to our follow-up, our apologies department. Beth, according to Amy, it was Coke adds life, not Coke is life.
I will accept that correction.
And not only that, I've checked it out. I think you got too confused because there's Coke adds life, but there's also Coke is it.
Yes. So, I've actually gone back and I will give all the correct versions of the Coke slogans so as to clarify my past errors.
Hold on. Most importantly, when I mentioned that Max Headroom said Coca Cola catch the wave, I was correct.
Was really?
Yeah. That's the Ridley Scott directed Coke ad with Max Headroom.
I like it.
Link in the show notes.
All right, I'm not going to get them all out, but here's some of the more popular slogans. The first one was in 1886. Coca-Cola's been around for a long time. It is drink Coca-Cola.
That's not very good.
The famous one from 1971 that became the ending of Mad Men. I'd like to buy the world a Coke. And then Coke adds life was 1976, followed by Coke is it in 1982. Then there's red, white, and you.
That's the corniest one. Yep.
And then my personal favorite, always Coca-Cola, because they sponsored the Jays during their 1993 World Series, which they won. That's
the one that we'd be most nostalgic for, because that's dating back to 1993 and didn't get changed until 2000. Although, when I think of Coke, I tend to think of It's the Real Thing, which they would kind of go back and forth on since the 60s. However, there's a couple here that are great. They're totally worth mentioning. I think my favorite is 1906's The Great National Temperance Beverage.
Really?
Yes. Which was incidentally my nickname in high school.
I think my favorite was for Diet Coke, which I would rather pour down my drains to clear them than to drink. But
Diet Coke was the worst.
Just for the taste of it.
Diet Coke.
See? It's there forever.
Yes. Now, interestingly, when I was a kid in the late 80s, Ray Charles was part of an ad campaign to sponsor Diet Coke. This, as it turns out, was not so strange because in the 1960s to the 1970s, there were a ton of radio jingles for regular Coke called Things Go Better with Coke. And they got actual artists like the Supremes, The Who, Aretha Franklin, Tom Jones, Marvin Gaye to record songs that would incorporate that slogan, Things Go Better with Coke. Yeah. Of the many versions that are out there, because there's a whole album that collects them. There's over 100 variations.
My goodness.
Yeah. The best ones are by The Fifth Dimension, The Moody Blues, Ray Charles, surprise, surprise. But the absolute best is by The Who, and they create this kind of Oingo Boingo-esque song where they just chant Coke after Coke after Coke after Coca-Cola. It's kind of amazing. Sadly, that's not the version they put up on YouTube for some reason, even though that's clearly the best of the two The Who Cokes. Yeah. But there's a ton of those. That album is totally worth checking out if you're into novelty records about Coca-Cola, and I am, I guess. But moving on, we've now entered quite early the festive season of Gamuary, which is a month-long celebration of cinema's favorite 50-foot turtle. And now that Gamuary and Christmas are combined into a kind of turtle duckin', do you have any objections?
So, just to clarify, this particular episode has a Christmassy feel to it. The sketches have, well, I won't spoil it yet, but there's a Christmas theme, so we get to add December and January together in this particular episode.
Yeah, this is technically the first Christmas special.
I did enjoy Crow as a Christmas tree.
All right then. Well, let's get into that. Let's put our limbs into our bodies and spin away as we describe Gamera.
This time we watched KTMA, episode 5, Gamera. A Japanese research team made up of zoologist Dr. Hidaka, his daughter and assistant Kyoko, and a brash young reporter named Ayagi are visiting a remote Eskimo village when a squadron of mysterious, silent aircraft fly overhead. Our heroes consider ominously that this might be a sign of the impending World War III. But the prospect of another devastating world war proves to be a red herring. One of the mysterious planes is taken down by an American jet fighter, and the crash immediately wakes up Gamera, a giant turtle who is none too pleased to be woken up from his long hibernation. He retaliates by destroying the research ship the heroes arrived on. But don't worry, Dr. Hidaka and his companions are not trapped in this frozen wasteland because in this reality, American Airlines apparently runs a transport hub at the North Pole. Hidaka and his companions jet set in style to New York City, where the eminent zoologist warns the world of the monster Gamera, but reasons that the giant turtle isn't long for this world because he's been irradiated. Strike one, Doctor. The monster is next seen in Japan, where he makes first contact with the most annoying boy in the world, Kenny, a weirdo who's obsessed with turtles. After Gamera catches Kenny when he falls off a lighthouse, hey, how did that kid get up there so fast in the first place? Kenny becomes Gamera's #1 hype man, insisting to everyone who will listen, and many who won't, that Gamera is a good and honorable turtle, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. Oh, and meanwhile, creepy reporter Ayagi continues to stalk Kyoko around the world, successfully wearing her down until she becomes his girlfriend. Anywho, the grown-ups quickly figure out that Gamera actually likes heat, and atomic bombs seem to liven him right up. So instead they try to freeze him into submission. He falls on his back as a result, which is amusing for all involved. But Gamera has a trick up his sleeve. Or rather, he has a rocket pack up his sleeve, as each of his limbs emits a flame that allows him to levitate like a flying saucer. Eventually, Japan reaches out to the international community. American, Soviet, and Japanese scientists work together on Z-Plan, which involves luring Gamera into a rocket ship and flying him out into space. Kenny insists that one day he'll visit Gamera there. Here's hoping, kid.
Meanwhile, in space, it's a very satellite love Christmas. We open with a typically chipper Joel spending his first Christmas in space. He's even got a tree. Wait, that's Crow. Joel cues Cambot to show a flashback to a moment that occurred between last week's Gamera vs. Barragan and today's episode. Joel froze Crow and dressed him up like a Christmas tree. Tom is largely absent from today's episode, presumably fearing Joel's stir-crazy Christmas decorating. Tom Servo praises the Chromas tree in segment 2, still sporting his Pee Wee Herman voice from last episode. Joel, not playing favorites, threatens to turn Tom into the ornament on top of the satellite of love. Tom, reverting back to his original identity of Beeper, beeps and answers Joel in the affirmative before his true personality takes over again. Joel and Tom then take their first call, a transcript of which happens in front of a still from a random Punky Brewster episode. The caller wants to know who does Joel's hair, so Cambot plays the show's end credits to reveal that hair is done by Sir Crow of Beverly Hills. Tom, reading the rest of the credits, asks what a puppet operator is, and Joel acts like a parent whose child just asked him about sex. Another caller suggests Godzilla joined the cast of the show in segment 3. Joel cajoles Gypsy into doing her Godzilla impression like a proud parent embarrassing a child. Later, he asks viewers to call in to complete a survey on the Ted Turner colorization controversy, asking such questions as, is Ted Turner dumb enough to colorize the opening to The Wizard of Oz? They take more calls in segment 4, and it's a real Raz versus Plavim situation. One call comes from the Coalition of Friends for Giant Mutant Turtles, and another from the Coalition for Giant Slimy Lizards with Long Nasty Tongues. The former slips some mild profanity on the air unbleeped. The latter think Gamera cheated in his fight with Barragan, and Cambot manages to spell Coalition wrong twice. Joel and Tom rewatch the Barragan fight and determine Gamera to be the winner fair and true. If the footage from last week's Gamera movie felt like they were filling time, get used to it. Joel replays the footage of Crow getting frozen from the top of the show before he and Gypsy sing O Tenenbot in front of the Crowsmas tree. Tom, hiding from the potential pain inflicted by a relative at Christmas time, remains the most relatable character in this week's episode. Hey, we're back. It's Gamuary. It's time for turtle decorations and wearing one's protective shell emotionally.
Yeah, it's really surprising to see a Christmas-themed episode in KTMA of all places. What did you think of it?
Well, I think that this was probably the best episode to recommend for someone who wants to dip into KTMA.
Oh, wow.
Yes, because Gamera versus Barragan, while colorful in places, is kind of a slog to watch on its own. It has its moments, but those moments are few and far between if you're watching the thing without a lot of riffs. This, you're watching the absolutely bonkers Sandy Frank dub of a really cute movie. And Gamera is just fun to watch. I would say, despite the greater budget and the sometimes pretty colors of Gamera versus Barragan, this is the more interesting movie, and it's weird and it's charming, and the dub is so baffling at times with either the line readings or the way that the script has been adapted, because it follows the plot. This is an uncut version of the movie, just as all the Sandy Frank dubs are, but it's as if it's been adapted by a third grader. So yeah. It's super, super fun to watch. Like, all of the line deliveries made me laugh harder than any of the jokes, particularly, "It's the devil's envoy, giant birds." Or my absolute favorite, sorry, when the drunk farmer sees the UFO Gamera, and he just delivers the line as though he doesn't realize there's more of the line left. Like, he's like, "Perhaps this is the UFO people were talking about."
Maybe it's the flying saucer that I heard them talk about so much lately.
You're hammered.
Like, it's insane. Why would anyone say it that way?
Yeah, a particular favorite of mine are the non-actors playing the American radar soldiers, I guess, for lack of a better word. They basically have Buddy Hackett giving out recommendations to search and destroy to an American jet fighter. And the actors are just, well, they're not actors. I don't know where they found these guys, but
they were white people near the studio.
Yeah, they can't act. They don't look very good on camera. It's one of the most wonderful things to ever be put on celluloid.
Yeah, those scenes have a real David Lynch quality.
Yeah. Beyond that, I am not a huge fan of this movie. I find it a bit of a slog, but I have to admit, I think I'm just getting a little bit down on monster movies in general, because the formulas are starting to become extremely noticeable the more we watch them. As for the riffing, it's interesting because there's only one guy doing it, and it's Joel. And he's got some good ones. I like his cute little one about when Gamera first shows up out of the ice, and he goes, "Who can walk through any snowplow's fury?" To come up with that on the fly is pretty good. And then his utter disgust with Kenny, where he actually just talks about wanting to punch this kid at many points, I enjoyed because it just seems so truthful. So I enjoyed that, but I mean, there's not a lot of riffing. You're mostly just watching the movie by yourself.
That's why I'd recommend it. This is just watching the movie with your cool pal Joel, who does get super condescending towards Kenny later on. Like when Kenny starts his obsession with Gamera, you just hear Joel super passive aggressively go, "Yes, Kenny, Gamera's a good turtle." Yeah. It's great.
I'd also say, like, this episode is worth checking out for the very good segments, which have a strange kind of loose-limbed humor to them that feels very very uncontrived in a lot of ways. The way that they're playing with the audience in a way that obviously they couldn't when they moved onto a network. Like the fact that the audience is getting in on the joke and they're building on each other. Like, it has a very almost Michel Gondry-ish kind of feel to it, where you're just kind of playing with yarn and coming up with something interesting as you go along.
I'd say it's closer to what would have been, I guess, kind of a contemporary at the time, the YTV PJs segments, in that you had your various PJs, which were programming jockeys for YTV, the children's network.
On Canada, probably our American listeners have never heard of it.
That's where I was going. But they were often accompanied by puppets, the best of which being this large green chia pet-looking creature named Warren the Grog. And it's very reminiscent of that, because I actually spoke to the guy who played Snit, which was the television that looked like chewing gum. It was like a chewing gum exterior and this big TV monitor that had a close-up of chattering teeth. And that's how this elaborate puppet would communicate. And I spoke to the guy who created and voiced Snit and operated the puppet.
Oh.
And the way he describes it is essentially how the KTMA host segments were done, where they filmed a bunch in a day. They would film like that episode or that day's worth of programming all at once. And there was no script. It was just come up with something.
Oh, okay.
And you really get that here, and you get the sense that that's why like the callers are being brought in, and Joel and Josh Weinstein, who is the only other cast member seen, are kind of getting in touch with their inner Larry King and getting all of these calls on the air. I don't know if there are this many calls in later episodes. It doesn't feel like it.
I wonder why Josh Weinstein was not in the theater, because he's clearly doing the segments.
He doesn't have an explanation looking into it, because it was a long time ago. But it is interesting. It's probably just a matter of he was available for one day or one period of filming and not the other. Probably, I remember there was an interview where he said it was probably a stand-up gig that prevented him from being in the theater. We should mention in that very same interview that we'll have a link to via Satellite News, Joel mentions that doing Gamera was like taking one for the team, just doing it by himself. But this is also like a watershed moment for the series, a revelation, because when he was speaking at MIT in 2009, Joel said, and I quote, "I felt like our whole thing solidified around the Gamera movies. Once those happened, we found our place in the universe. We knew that this was going to work," referring to K04 and K05.
Yeah, it's funny that this little turtle that could ended up being what really crystallized MST3K as a concept. People really seem to respond to Gamera versus Barragan, if the call-ins are any indication. I wonder if they got even more of a response from Gamera then.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, because I know that they introduce at some point during this run of Gamera episodes the idea of the Mads forcing Joel to watch the movies, as opposed to the kind of vagaries of Joel picking out the films himself, because people were starting to complain that there were too many Gamera movies in a row.
Oh, okay. So how did this whole Gamera thing start, besides being an obvious ripoff of Godzilla?
Well, it didn't start off that way.
What the hell you say?
Yeah, it had nothing to do with Godzilla, or at least it was going to be less obvious competition. Beth, it wasn't supposed to be a turtle. It was never supposed to be a turtle.
Really?
Yes, if you were going to make a giant monster movie, do you really think it'd be a turtle?
Well, no, but, you know.
Well, there you go. There's even, it's a plot point in the movie that Gamera can't move when he's on his back. It's as though they're laughing at their own concept. But of all the things you could have done, what do you think it would have been? If you were to make a giant monster movie in Japan in 1965, Beth, what would you do?
Well, you have your dinosaur taken by Godzilla already.
That's right. He's the genus Godzillasaurus.
So that kind of takes out, you know, dinosaurs in general. So a shark? Some really big sea creature?
Yes, it'll be a shark on land, not unlike that Bob's Burgers episode.
I mean, it's a very ocean-focused economy, so maybe sharks that want to eat all of Japan would be quite terrifying.
Perhaps.
I'm really reaching here, dude.
Yeah. No, we have to think about creatures on land. And what was originally conceived was a giant rat movie called A Swarm of Beasts Nizula.
Okay, rats. Yeah, I can get behind that.
And so they had Dai, who were trying to compete with Toho with Godzilla, thought, well, we can't have a Godzilla-type creature. We'll get eaten alive. At this point, Godzilla had spawned Rodan, the pterodactyl, Mothra, King Ghidorah, the three-headed dragon. They'd done the giant monsters that shoot stuff
Right.
out of their mouths. They perfected it. No one else could do it better. So instead of having one giant monster, they'd have a bunch. They'd have essentially a rat king crawl over Tokyo, which is not a bad idea.
Yeah.
So Dai was starting to figure out, it was their first real big budget sci-fi movie. And they're trying to figure out how to do it. And much like the original Godzilla, stop motion was way too expensive and time consuming.
Mm.
And so they thought puppeteering was also like too labor intensive. But we know how to build miniatures and do a pretty good job of it. We can hire whoever's not working at Toho to build them. Tell you what, let's build a bunch of miniatures and just throw real rats on them.
Okay. I can see where that might not go the way you expect it to.
Yeah, well, first they got domestic rats, and they didn't do anything. And the crew actually found them too adorable to make them work long hours.
All right.
And so since they were too genteel and docile, you'd think maybe they'd go back to the puppeteering or stop motion roots. Nope. They got sewer rats.
Okay. They bite.
Yeah, they bit the handlers.
Yeah.
And scurried off the tiny sets and basically ran amok in the neighborhood. Like, Dai was investigated when homeowners near the studio called in to prevent a potential infestation of rats.
Okay.
So this project was a disaster. And there was no hope of ever making a good Rat King movie.
They could have just borrowed the ape suit guy for Roman. I'm sure he's still looking for work.
Yeah, they say he's the best ape suit guy in the business. And honestly, an all rat body wearing a diving helmet would be very unique. And would certainly reap, I think, some continued box office success from Roman. But after their rat investigation more or less embarrassed the studio, they had a weird moment of inspiration where the president of Dai claims that he was on a flight from America to Japan, and he looked out the window and he saw what he thought looked like a turtle floating amongst the clouds.
Oh, how lovely.
And this moment of inspiration led to, it has to be a flying turtle. So rather than the fire-breathing aspect, it was the craziest thing about the movie, which is that Gamera is the explanation for UFOs. Maybe UFOs don't exist. It's only flying turtles. That aspect of the movie was the first one devised. And so they did about 50 sketches to try and get the look of Gamera down. And when interviewed later, the character designer for Gamera said, there was no difference between the first sketch and the 50th sketch. There's only so many ways you can draw a turtle. At some point, they decided on fire breathing. They got someone who worked at Toho, a costume designer named Masao Yagi, to essentially construct the costume. They filmed the entire thing in black and white because it was easier to blend in optical effects without having to put them through the color process, which tended to make things stand out a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, like, there's a couple times when this movie looks good for 1965. Like, it's funny, the shots where Gamera is holding a Kenny doll in his hand look predictably terrible.
Right.
But the shot of Kenny falling into Gamera's hand, where he just falls into this silhouetted area, looks really good. It's like really well done. But anyway, because the movie had so many problems, like they'd already eaten up a lot of budget and indeed their reputation on A Swarm of Beasts, Nuzula. So they got a novice director to make the movie, which seems like a really bad idea, but it's all that Dai could get on their budget. No experienced director wanted to handle anything that was attached to Swarm of Beasts, Nuzula.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the director of the film, Noriaki Yuasa. They got him because his career was totally on the line.
Oh.
Yeah. No one at Dai really trusted him because of his age. He was 32 when he directed Gamera. And I guess by comparison, Godzilla's Ishiro Honda was 43 when he directed that movie. And because he had this low status, Yuasa was frequently belittled by producers and even sometimes the crew.
So, you're telling me this director on the line gets no respect at all.
He's the original Rodney Dangerfield. This film's a real ladybugs. Well, it's more of a lady rats. But they managed to get the film on time. It's shot super, super quickly, and they make a competent, sometimes striking, definitely weird giant monster movie. And some of the weirdness comes from Yuasa himself, because the director essentially guided the screenwriter into establishing the Kenny relationship. And this starts giant monsters and children being together when they were never meant to be. And there's a surprisingly decent explanation for this terrible blight on monster movies of the 60s and 70s. And it's just to make Gamera different. They needed to make Gamera different than Godzilla. So they gave the angle that Gamera is a protector of children. But the reason why that's not overstated, it's only Kenny who is talking about it, and everyone treats him like a little kook because he is. The way it's portrayed in the movie, or the way it reads to me, is that it just seems like, oh, Gamera just reacts seeing him fall, almost catches him as a reflex action, and then drops him and flies away and continues to kill everybody.
Yeah, like, it's so funny this became such a powerful plot line, like Gamera is a friend of children, because they absolutely did not commit to it in this movie. Like, it is clear that Kenny is completely out of his gourd.
Yeah, it's odd. If you got the impression that it was supposed to be that, and the later films misinterpreted or retconned that, because of course later movies in the original series, Gamera loves children, and that is returned tenfold. But the reason it's like this, and the reason it's ambiguous, is that Yuasa wanted that to be in the movie, but didn't want Dai to figure that out because he was afraid that they would cut it for being too weird and too different. So that's why it's just hinted at. And in later movies, when Yuasa returned to the Gamera series, he made that at the forefront of Gamera movies. And he's the only one, I think, that really makes Gamera a pal to children in the films that he directed.
Which was successful.
Yeah. Despite all the shit that he got for making this movie, it proved to be a big hit for Dai and did exactly what they hoped it would do, in that it spawned a potential rival to Godzilla. Beth, were you ever in the UN, model or otherwise?
I have never been in a situation where that was a thing.
Oh.
I don't know if it's a big Canadian thing to model UN. It seems like more of an American thing.
I suppose that's true, although I do know that Canada was featured on that episode of The Simpsons because we were portrayed by Ralph Wiggum.
Did appreciate that. The irony there is that America, for the most part, has been pretty out of love with the UN, especially with this particular administration, which is ironic because when I looked into it, the US was basically the reason for the UN. They're the ones who really got it going during the Truman administration, and they pitch in by far the biggest budget to keep it going. And that's one of the things that people still get in America get so annoyed about, is that they have to pay so much compared to other people to keep this sometimes relatively ineffectual body going. But it's funny, in the 60s, it was still very much this feeling that it was going to actually be what we needed to create world peace, to ensure that there was enough understanding and cooperation, that we would not need to have world wars anymore, because we wouldn't be kind of fenced off into our own nations, because nationalism creates conflict, right? So it was interesting to compare this, I thought, which is very pro-internationalism. Like, you can actually argue that Gamera brought together the world, because before Gamera, there's
the first time that has been said.
Because before that, there's this suggestion that they're on the brink of World War III, and it's only because they're forced to cooperate, kind of like a Watchmen scenario, that they can actually put aside their differences and work towards a greater goal. Stopping Gamera.
Much like Watchmen, you always see Gamera's cock in every third frame. At least that's what I thought his tail was the first time I saw it.
So So, whereas Godzilla is very much a Japan-focused movie, like the Godzilla is in many ways a representation of the trauma of the atomic bombs, kind of turned into a monster. The solution is very, one or two Japanese scientists who are very reluctant to bring the solution down, which might even be worse than the monster. So it's this, really kind of attenuated consideration of, what should be brought into the world and what has to be wrought. And it seems like it's something that only I think Japan at that time could have created. So, I mean, not to say that it's nationalist, but it's just very focused on Japan and its trauma.
And perhaps it is a very Japanese moment in a movie that the solution to the horrible problem, which was brought on by Americans and the initial bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is an honorable suicide of a good Japanese man.
Hey, that's a good point. Yeah. So it has a very different feel from this more kind of American-style internationalism, which is very reminiscent of The Crawling Eye, where it's very much like, the UN, but obviously, America's running the show here. And so the Americans feature very prominently in this movie, even though it's Dr. Hidaka who is mainly charging the reins. But it's very much the sense that the Americans are the world's police. So to some extent, they have to be in on what's going on.
Yes, and they help realize Plan Z from inner space to put a stop to Gamera, but it's strictly, following on the data collected by Dr. Hidaka, and of course provided on that stone from the Inuit man at the very beginning of the movie.
Yeah, so what do you think? There's 10 years between Godzilla and Gamera, which might explain the kind of shift in world politics we're seeing between these two movies. But did you think that was at all striking?
I do, because it reflects kind of how the Toho movies of Ishiro Honda, who directed the original Godzilla, kind of evolved. Because you get, as is often the case with Godzilla movies, you get anti-American sentiment in the original Godzilla. And rightfully so. But as time changed Honda, and as his experiences as a director kind of brought him greater prosperity and fame, he tended to focus on humanity coming together to defeat a threat. And in his films, Americans tended to be portrayed in kinder lights. I don't know if the fact that they were dealing with American distribution played into that, but Honda himself said in interviews that in his 60s and 70s films, he wanted to focus on like all of humanity coming together to stop a greater evil. And I think you see that being imitated here.
Because the UN was basically born of the fear of the atomic bomb, right? They reasoned, maybe rightfully so, that the only way they could ensure that this would not destroy the world is if we all came together for a common good. And of course, by the late 70s and 80s, the East versus West kind of gridlock and North versus South was making the UN seem more and more ineffectual. But it did cause basically global trade, which we have now. So it did contribute to globalization. So I suppose we have that. But yeah, it's just, back then there was a much more optimistic feel that this actually could solve the world's problems through international cooperation.
Yes, back then globalization just meant putting Gamera in a giant globe.
And pouring him off to space.
Where he'll never return.
So, this is obviously not the original version of this film. Those Americans, I think, are inserts. That's just my hunch.
Ah, well, you'd be wrong. This is the original version of this film.
Really?
Yes, this is the Sandy Frank dub of the original Japanese.
I am astonished that those aren't just inserts to help sell it to American audiences.
No, they retitled this film Gamera with 2 M's, The Invincible, the following year. And they shot new footage with American actors.
Actual actors.
Well, people who have acted. I would not call Brian Donlevy, who has the main role as a general, an actor, as he stunk up those Quatermass movies for Hammer, ruining some, I think, really good movies with his terrible drunken acting. But yes, they decided to do exactly what American studios had done with the Americanized version of Godzilla and the Americanized release of Toho's King Kong vs. Godzilla by inserting American actors. And the new footage was shot by Sandy Howard. He directed these inserts, but he's better known as a producer. He produced A Man Called Horse and City on Fire, which was later riffed on KTMA, and Jaguar Lives, starring, you guessed it, Donald Pleasance. The dub of the movie makes use of the accent, which I described on the Gamera versus Barragan episodes that we did, which is essentially where you have American actors thinking that, New York and other American accents would sound weird out of Japanese characters who are supposed to be from and living in Japan. It's them imitating what Japanese English sounds to them. And it now may seem weird, but at the time it was a token of respect. And interestingly, so all the stuff that you get is with the American Arctic base, which shoots down the fighter plane at the very beginning of the movie. That's all been reshot with actors, and there's now, even though it seems tokenistic from a 2018 perspective, there's a woman and a person of color there. There's a black guy there, which at the time would have been, again, a nice gesture, but now comes across as a bit tokenistic.
Right.
The movie opens with a 60s rock song about Gamera, which is a Beatles sound-alike that is totally great by The Moons. We'll have a link to that in our show notes. For the most part, the lines are a lot better, obviously. The dialogue's a lot better than the Sandy Frank version, although the Inuit chief from the very beginning of the movie does get, I think, my favorite line of the dub, which is, "This Gamera is obviously an object of terror." And even better, even though the headlines don't spin, the American version of Gamera adds headlines jumping in front of the camera, and one of which reads, "Giant turtle, baloney, says scientists."
I hope it's spelled baloney, Baloney.
You are correct, sir.
So 50s.
Yes, there's mention of Canada. I watched this with a friend of mine, so there's a couple mentions of Canada, one at the very beginning.
The expedition, with American and Canadian cooperation, seeks an open water route across the top of the continent, Henry Hudson's fabled Northwest Passage.
Which got us to go, yay! And later on, when Gamera flies away, when he first emerges from the ice, it's mentioned that he goes from Alaska onto Saskatchewan and Toronto. Again, yay. There is a TV debate about whether or not Gamera is real. That's one of the inserted scenes. And it's the best part of any version of this movie. So that's why I'm totally recommending this redone American cut called Gamera the Invincible, because there's a debate between Dr. Emmerich Contraire and one Jules Manning. Manning is played by Mort Marshall. He looks like Lewis Black, and he's a voiceover actor on Tennessee Tuxedo. Contraire, on the other hand, Contraire, is voiced by Alan Oppenheimer, Skeletor, in his first film role.
My goodness.
Yeah, Skeletor has the line, "It would not be the first time Washington has kept the truth from the public, whether it be flying saucers or Gamera."
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
It's time for Shallow 13. 13 quick thoughts about this episode and its movie, Gamera. Go Adam, go.
After directing Gamera's screen debut, Noriaki Yuasa would direct 6 of the film's 7 sequels, including Space Monster Gamera, which killed off the turtle in 1980. Space Monster Gamera, aka Gamera Super Monster, was a clip show with a few newly shot bits of linking footage that was designed as a quick cash grab to save Dai from bankruptcy. It didn't work.
The one film in the original Gamera series not directed by Yuasa was its higher budgeted sequel, Gamera vs. Barragan. The more established Shigeo Tanaka helmed Barragan, while Yuasa was demoted from director to special effects duties.
German distributors didn't think much of the Titanic Turtles' box office appeal and renamed the film Gamera, Frankenstein's Monster from the Ice. Still not sensing the turtle as a big name, Gamera vs. Barragan was retitled Godzilla, der Drache aus dem Dschungel, or Godzilla, the Dragon out of the Jungle.
A deleted scene had Kenny meeting Tuxedo Mask. Well, kind of. Scripted and shot, but later deleted, was a scene where Kenny's friends asked the turtle-obsessed youth to come listen to records. He had friends. One of his pals, played by Toru Furuya, became a well-known voice actor. In addition to his role as Tuxedo Mask in the original Sailor Moon, he also had major roles in Dragon Ball Z and Mobile Suit Gundam.
Tuxedo Mask. Another deleted scene featured two strippers who don't realize that Gamera is destroying the city until his foot comes crashing through the Gentleman's Club. While initially believed to be deleted in the scripting stages, actors Chiduru Ko and Ryoku Oki are credited as Stripper A and Stripper B, respectively, in the Japanese closing credits. No footage from this scene has been released as of this Gamuary season.
Gamera is the first black and white film riffed in the series, as every single film featured in the KTMA era was in color, including the unaired Green Slime pilot. By contrast, the following season on Comedy Central consists almost entirely of black and white films, with only 2 films in color.
When Gamera scares Kenny near the lighthouse, Joel jokes that it's Tibby all grown up. According to director Noriaki Yuasa, many children believed Gamera and Tibby to be one and the same, either because they forgot about or missed the opening scene where Gamera emerges from his icy slumber and flies to Japan, or they believed 2 giant turtles were running around, I guess.
When the reporter shows his armband to Hidaka and his daughter, Joel quips,
"No ticky, no shirty."
The phrase would be quoted occasionally in future seasons and originates from an ancient and, kind of racist, street joke about Chinese launderers. Variations of the punchline include no tiki, no washi, and no tiki, no laundry. So ubiquitous was this joke at one time that it inspired the title of 1915's comedy short No Tiki, No Washi, and the 1921 cartoon No Tiki, No Shirty.
Pay close attention after Joel leaves the theater during the scene where Kenny's father scolds him for having a turtle. After a few moments, the theater seats vanish and aren't seen again until Joel returns to the theater.
Some fans suspected that Joel Hodgson and company faked the calls from the various monster coalitions who phoned in that week. Joel denies the rumor. He suspects viewers were calling in to prove that they had understood the humor of the show, and were maybe even auditioning to be on it. On the other hand, J. Elvis Weinstein told Satellite News, "I have no reason to believe we wouldn't have faked a call for a joke. There were never any discussions about maintaining journalistic integrity."
Joel also stated that the 2 calls from 2 differing monster coalitions is too Python-esque to have been written by the MST3K crew. Ironically, Joel refers to Gamera as Spiny Norman, a reference to Monty Python's Piranha Brothers sketch in which a lowlife named Dinsdale Piranha is pursued by a large cartoon hedgehog that cries, "Dinsdale! Dinsdale!"
At one point, Cambot shows us a screen cap of 80s sitcom Punky Brewster. It's from an episode called It's a Dog's Life, in which Punky is grounded for not taking care of her dog. The punishment prevents her from going on a yacht with her friends, which is why Punky's wearing a sailor's hat, and she ends up wishing she could be a dog.
This cues a real Freaky Friday situation where Punky and her dog Brandon switch places, hence the episode title. Now don't worry about the earth-shattering consequences of the dog-human transfer. The final moments of the episode reveal it was all a dream.
And that's time.
All right, so we have jabs at Ted Turner, which really dates this episode. I haven't heard colorization jokes in a long, long time.
Right, because it was definitely something that seemed to be an existential threat to the artistry of film in the 80s, from what I can see from just looking up old articles. But by the time we were becoming aware people, I think it had pretty much petered out as a thing.
Yeah, Ted Turner colorizing movies was a punchline in the 90s, and I can, for some reason, remember it being a punchline frequently on Murphy Brown. Yeah, I'm not sure why, but that's how it was. But generally speaking, Ted Turner's plan to colorize the MGM film library to keep it financially viable only made sense from the perspective of someone who didn't care about movies.
Yeah, somebody who had no concept of film quality or artistry, like just the most crass kind of business-like knee-jerk response. People don't like to watch black and white movies. If we make them colorful, people will actually want to watch them. Never mind the difference in pacing, the difference in, subject, like so many other things that make older movies a little bit harder for contemporary people to access now. It's just because it's not covered in rainbows.
And besides, the only reason people don't like to watch black and white movies is because people are dumb.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there's a great article on on this by Roger Ebert, which dates back to the 1980s, and I quote, "I have no doubt that there are sincere people who believe that colorization improves a movie, that a black and white movie is somehow missing something. These people are sincere, but they are not thoughtful. They have never looked inside to ask themselves what their standards are, why they enjoy what they enjoy, why certain movies work for them. Everyone has seen many black and white movies. Were they not enjoyable? Did they not seem appropriate in black and white? Were they missing something? Were they, for example, missing an ugly overcoat of colors slapped on top of the blacks and whites and grays to provide a tarted up imitation of color like cosmetics on a corpse?"
Oof, yes, I also read that. I highly recommend it. We'll have it in our show notes. He also explains like why colorization of films that were originally shot in black and white just don't work.
Well, yes, I mean, like with black and white photography, it's specifically designed to be viewed in black and white. So the way, like, have you ever noticed, to pivot a little bit, have you ever noticed that films that were shot in color, because like it's not common to use black and white film stock, and they have to reduce color digitally. They have to turn it to monochrome. It doesn't look right because it's lit for color. It's lit for what the camera actually sees. So films like the Coen brothers, the Man Who Wasn't There, or the black and white version of The Mist by Frank Darabont look like shit because they're not lit for black and white.
Yeah, exactly. Like, Ebert kind of points this out, like, because you can't rely on color to differentiate, your set pieces, your lighting have to make sure that things don't just kind of tend towards what he describes as a shapeless blur. You have to pay a meticulous attention to light and shadow in ways that you really don't have to in color. And some of the most beautiful movies I've seen are in black and white because that limited palette allows for attention to different things that you can't when you're just saturated in a whole bunch of different colors.
Yes. For our listeners at home, Beth is referring to the best movie ever made, Oingo Boingo's Forbidden Zone, starring Hervé Villechaize.
Like, okay. Well, maybe we should just get some recommendations. What is your favorite black and white movie? What do you think is the most beautiful one?
I honestly think one of the most beautiful black and white movies is Godzilla. That's one, like, it's documentary style, and it has an effect that wouldn't work in color, which is when you see Godzilla marching across the skyline, it looks like you can't tell where his body ends and the sky begins, and it's a really creepy effect. And that wouldn't work in Technicolor.
Mm-hmm. My favorites tend to be, movies like the musicals by Busby Berkeley in the 30s, the MGM studio type stuff. The example I always use, and it's a relatively obscure movie, but is the 1930s Warner Brothers version of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just so sparkly.
And there's something, I think, very hypnotic and dreamlike about a lot of the movies that you mentioned there, that is just like an inadvertent quality of the way that you had to light black and white movies.
Yeah, exactly.
And people got so good at lighting and shooting for black and white that after a while, black and white television started to look incredible and still does to this day. And what I'd recommend is a high budget show like The Twilight Zone. Looks just incredible in all but the episodes that are shot on videotape, which they did to save money. Those episodes look like crap, but the majority of the show, which was shot on 35 millimeter film, looks like film-like. Mm-hmm. It looks like a big budget movie shot in 1:33.
Yeah, in many ways, it's like a lost art. So I can see why so many filmmakers were absolutely outraged. The Ebert review mentions that when Turner was getting ready to colorize It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart tried to go and talk to him personally. Frank Capra was on his deathbed and tried to say, please don't do this to my movie.
Not to mention, I remember the first time I heard about it was Orson Welles. I was reading about Orson Welles as a child because that's who I am. And one of the things he said in an interview was, "You tell Ted Turner to keep his damn Crayolas away from my movie."
Because it was also a very awkward and elementary process. People claim, and I'll have another link in the show notes, that digitization has made this a lot more accurate and less garish, but from what I've seen, it still doesn't do a very good job.
Now, before we totally get off the topic, it's interesting that there is a connection between colorization and Mystery Science Theater.
How so?
Well, Mike Nelson, when the show ended and he was trying things out in LA, seeing what kind of work he could get later on, pitching shows, Best Brains at this point had disbanded. He ended up in San Francisco where Legend Films had started up. And Legend Films initially was a project to colorize old public domain or kind of unwanted movies, your Glen or Glendas, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And their very first project, or one of their first projects, was a colorized version of Reefer Madness, and they got the bright idea, oh, let's hire Mike Nelson to do a funny commentary for it.
Oh.
Who made Reefer Madness would still be alive to record commentary. Might as well get the guy from Mystery Science Theater. And Legend teamed up with Mike Nelson to form the company Riff Tracks. So they still release Riff Tracks on DVD when it's public domain or stuff that's easy to procure the copyright for.
Right.
But yeah, that all got started just because a little company wanted to colorize some movies and thought Mike Nelson's name would be a good way to sell it. Beth, this is a Christmas special.
Kind of.
Despite being in the Gamuary season. Firmly planted in the Gamuary season. So let's address that. Let's talk about the most prominent Christmas thing that we see, which is Crow as a makeshift Christmas tree.
Yeah, he's blasted with, I think, liquid nitrogen or something. Anyway, he's frozen in place, and then they just throw a bunch of tinsel on him, and he becomes a makeshift Christmas tree.
It's haunting.
Yeah, it is.
It's like this particular design of Crow where the eyes have, like, there's no ability to express anything with those eyes. They're just big ping pong hooks that are just hiding out there. It's totally vacant. It's creepy.
Yeah. It's almost as creepy as Elf on a Shelf, which I don't know if I can be friends with anybody who follows that tradition.
Oh.
But I do love Christmas trees. I think it's one of my favorite things about the holiday season, that and outdoor lights, because it just makes everything so pretty. We have a fake Christmas tree, and it's known as a cigarette tree because it's very skinny to fit in little apartments.
Oh, I thought it had the refreshing taste of tobacco if you rolled up a branch.
If only. And I just really enjoy decorating it every year. I think it's a wonderful tradition. And apparently it's relatively new, at least to the holiday season scene. And what makes me very happy, it was introduced in the Victorian era to basically English-speaking countries.
I'm just going to go down a limb, going along with the O Tannenbot gag from this episode and the famed song that's riffing on, and assume that this is a German tradition that was brought to the English-speaking world.
Yes, and before that, apparently it came from Latvia.
Oh.
But anyway, one of the reasons you get so many evergreens and boughs is because, they're one of the few things that still look fresh and green during, like, the coldest and darkest of the winter months. So it's a nice way to bring in some festivity into your house. And in fact, most of the first Christmas trees were hung upside down from chandelier hooks. Yeah. And they were decorated with food for the most part, dried food. And so they also used candles, which caused a lot of fires.
I read about that. There's nothing funnier to me than a Christmas where the family house burns down.
There's actually... Yes, to the point where they I think they were eventually banned in America. I should also mention they were brought to the Victorians by Prince Albert, who is a German, and so there's this lovely woodcut of young Victoria and young Albert and their children around the tree. And when that was exported to America, they got rid of her crown and got rid of his mustache so that they looked a little less threatening to Americans.
And for any references to how their tree looked, didn't they remove the piercing that was at the tip of that tree?
Sure, yes.
It's a regular Prince Albert. Typically found in cans.
But yes, and quite early on in the creation of kind of electric lights were used to replace very dangerous candles on a tree. Although I've heard, and this is coming from John Hodgman on his podcast, where he mentions he had neighbors who actually did use candles, and it is apparently enchanting. It's so, like, the light is so beautiful, but you have to kind of stand there with a CO2 canister ready to blast, the latest solder. Like, you can't just enjoy it and walk away. It's like, okay, let's look at it for 10 minutes and then blow them all out.
You heard it here. John Hodgman said it's worth the risk.
I'm tempted to do it someday if I have a way of making it, like, maybe in the middle of a concrete slab in a shed somewhere, just to see what it looks like. Do you have a Christmas tree right now, Adam?
I'm not going to lie to you. I have taken a plastic cactus and I put exactly one unlit red bulb next to it.
Perfect.
And that's my Christmas tree.
Perfect. Very Charlie Brown of you.
Mm-hmm.
I also like how whenever you try to put lights on, say, a palm tree, it just ends up looking like a dick.
Yes, nature's cock.
All right, we've shipped all our turtles off to space. I think it's about time we had a final factoid. Chris?
All right, well, you guys were just talking about beloved Christmas song, O Tannenbaum. I've got 2 tiny factoids about that song for you. First off...
Hitler loved it.
Well, probably.
Just like Gamera.
But first off, it's not a Christmas song originally. It's just a song about how fir trees are nice. They added the Christmas stuff later. O Tannenbaum doesn't mean O Christmas tree. It means O fir tree.
Huh.
And secondly, the tune for O Tannenbaum, which we all know and love, either is or has been used as a state song for 4 different American states.
Hey, that's lazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been Florida, my Florida, Maryland, my Maryland, Michigan, my Michigan.
Guys!
Sucks.
And the Song of Iowa.
Well, it's at least, different than my blank.
Yeah, it's Iowa, oh, Iowa, because if there's one thing they love in Iowa, it's vowels.
Iowa.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you want to tell us about the special turtle in your life, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, or we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. In fact, this show is made possible by listeners like you, and you can help us by writing in, by talking about us on social media, or you can make all our spirits bright by supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters can listen to some juicy bonus bits by going to itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today on It's Just a Show, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/42.
Now, Chris, I hate to think with the controversy of starting Gamuary early that we would be into some kind of Gamera gate. What possibly awaits us for a future episode of It's Just a Show?
I just think we should watch this movie again. Maybe this time. Maybe if we watch it again, maybe Kenny will fall off that lighthouse.
Oh, fingers crossed.
And maybe he'll become a martyr. Maybe he'll become a martyr to the cause of all turtle lovers everywhere. And through his sacrifice, we will enter a new, glorious testudinal age. Let's find out with Season 3, Episode 2, which is also Gamera.
Yay, it's Lights Gamera action!
This is a cute one, so I look forward to the sketches and the rest. I do not look forward to sitting through this movie again.
Oh, it's going to be fun, because this time there's going to be jokes.
That will help. And it has one of the best Tom Servo songs.
That's right. We get, I think, the first Tom Servo song since Creepy Girl.
Well, all right, we will look forward to that. Before then, though, everybody should have a happy holiday and enjoy an early Gamuary.
Turtles and holidays. What more could you want?
And Tempest Adest Gameron, or Flowers for Gameron.
Excellent. Take it away, Theme Squad.
It's just a show, it's just a show. Sit back, relax, it's just a show. It's just a show, it's just a show. Sit back, relax, it's just a show. La 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 show, it's just a show. Sit back, relax, it's just a show.
What the hell you say?